Hiya, this is Miss C. I'm going to apologise now. The lighting's probably really bad. I'm obviously in a different place. And I also have the sweatiest face in the world. But I'm doing my makeup, so I thought I'd just record a quick video because I'd really like to get Macbeth done quite quickly. My aim is for any students that feel like this might be useful to have sort of a little bank of these videos, just giving you first of all the sort of summary of the stories of the key texts that a lot of us are studying. So for example, obviously Macbeth is the big one that a lot of you are studying. I might do a Romeo and Juliet because some schools do use that, although Macbeth is the most common. The other one I'm thinking of is an Inspector Calls, obviously, so on and so forth. Some of you may do a Christmas Carol, so I'm going to look into doing that. Jekyll and Hyde is another big one. I know that my school and other schools I've taught in have done that. So anyway, let's focus back on where we are so far. We have so far gotten up to we've done Act 1, 2 and 3 of Macbeth. Now I may not have a lot of time because little people may be running in and trying to distract me in a minute, so I'm going to try and be as quick as I can. So this may be just maybe Act 4 scenes 1 or scenes 1 and 2. The interesting thing about Act 4 in Macbeth is that it's only 3 scenes, and it's interesting because if you compare it to the act that comes after it, Act 5 is about 9 scenes if I'm correct. So we have these 3 scenes in Act 4 that are quite long, quite drawn out and very different in their location and their characters. And then you sort of get to Act 5 where we'll cover it when we get to it, but it's much more kind of action-packed and choppy. If it was a film, it would be like the final climactic car chase, you'd be cutting backwards and forwards between the baddies and the goodies. But Act 4 is more drawn out and it's all about building up that tension again, remembering the form of the play exactly. So we are starting Act 4. If you remember, at the end of Act 3, Shakespeare had Macbeth freaking out because he was seeing Banquo and the ghost at the banquet and all of this stuff. And he was really, really freaking out. And he decided that the only way to get any kind of reassurance was to go to the witches again. So what he decides to do is go and see the witches. And so if you remember, Hecate also made a little appearance in Act 3, and she'd told the witches that they had to lead him to his confusion. So for more information on that, you may just want to go back and watch the previous videos rather than me say it all again now. But when we get to Act 4, Scene 1, Macbeth has gone to the witches again. Now, the scene begins with them being very typically witchy. They are singing a song around a cauldron. They are throwing in all sorts of sort of witchy type things, like I think it's like a thumb of a sailor or bits of animals and all sorts of things, a newt's tail, kind of quite stereotypically witchy stuff. And essentially what they do is they say they know Macbeth's coming, and they say, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. And I always I like this because it makes, Macbeth is now the wicked one. Even though these are witches speaking, Macbeth is wicked. And in he comes, and essentially he asks them to give him some more information because he's obviously, as we know, he's kind of freaking out a little bit and he's feeling very insecure. Now, there's more to it than I'm going to explain now, but for the sake of just telling the story and for you to feel like you know what's going on story-wise and plot-wise, essentially they give him 3 more pieces of advice, okay? They give him 3 more pieces of advice, and one of those pieces of advice is to be bloody, bold and resolute, for no man of woman born shall harm Macbeth, okay? And quite understandably, Macbeth's like, wicked, I don't need to be scared then. Everyone's a woman born, so I don't need to be worried about anybody. I'm pretty much invincible. Now remember, Hecate told the witches to lead him to his destruction, to make him feel like he was invincible. And they tell him, I suppose, what we would say half-truths, because in theory, once we get to what happens later, it becomes clear that technically no man or woman born did harm Macbeth, but someone else can. And I don't want to kind of give away the ending, but well, you should know it by now. I'm assuming if you're watching this as a GCSE student. Anyway, so one of the things is, you know, be bloody bold and resolute. No man can harm, no man or woman born can harm Macbeth. And Macbeth's like, cool, brilliant, I'm laughing. Another one of the prophecies, or sort of the apparitions that comes out of the cauldron and gives him information, is another one that says, Macbeth shall be safe until the Burnham Woods move towards Dunsinane. Now, Dunsinane Castle is where Macbeth lives. And he essentially is told here, until the trees get up and move, or until the woods move towards your castle on their own, and they get up and move, you will be safe. And so Macbeth's like, well, trees can't get up and walk. So again, this is ridiculous. Of course, I'm safe. So he's getting more and more relaxed as these sort of apparitions go on. The final one just says, beware Macduff. All right. And so after these three, there is another little moment with the witches. Another apparition comes out because he sort of says, what's going on with Banquo? Because remember, Banquo was told by the witches, oh, your children will be kings. And he's like, well, what's going to happen with that? I don't know why he won't just let that go, but he won't let it go. And so they sort of say, seek to ask no more, seek no more answers. And he's like, no, I want to know. And so eventually there's another little bit with a procession, like all these sort of apparitions come out of the cauldron, and it's a procession of sort of these 8 kings that look like Banquo. And the suggestion is that there is going to be a line of kings that succeed him that are Banquo's children. I wouldn't worry too much about that. It's not a huge part of the overall story. So let's just stay focused on Macbeth's journey. So essentially, by the end of this little sort of event, Macbeth is kind of like, all right, brilliant then. So I'm pretty much safe. I'm laughing here. The only thing that I might need to do is think about Macduff, because he's the only person that I've been told that I need to be a bit careful about, right? I need to maybe keep an eye on what he's up to. So he's like, well, just to be safe then, I'm going to make sure that Macduff and all his wife and children are murdered, just to, you know, make sure that one prophecy is kind of listened to. Okay. And so I don't know, again, this is the sign that this is the way that we see Macbeth's decline into utter sort of tyranny and evil, because not only is he thinking, well, I've been told to beware Macduff, he's also like, well, I need to also get rid of Macduff's family, which seems a little bit harsh, but that's Macbeth. Ooh. Sorry, that was a bit scary. The door just opened on its own. So, next thing that happens, is as he's leaving, like the sort of cave or wherever it is that he was when this was all happening, he leaves the cave and he bumps into Lennox, and Lennox is there to sort of give him some information, and we'll find out what that is in a minute. But what I find really funny is that Macbeth sort of obviously, Macbeth pretends to kind of like be there innocently, and he's like, oh, did some witches just go past you? And Lennox is like, no. And he's like, oh, well, you know, cursed be the person that listens to them. And obviously he's saying this to really play into the idea that he never would listen to witches, but also there's a truth in it, isn't there? Because he is cursed, and he has got this downfall coming. So there's a sort of clever dramatic irony, subtle idea there that I think is quite interesting. Now, moving on to essentially where we see Macduff's days numbered, or Macduff's family's days numbered. The next part is that Lennox tells him that Macduff has fled to England, to Malcolm, and to sort of, he knows now that there are people fighting against him. There are people that don't want him in the throne. There are people that don't want him there. And so he's starting to become aware that holding on to this throne is worse than they originally thought. I suppose the original idea of just, oh, it'll be fine, you know, I just need to make sure that I sort of kill Banquo. Actually, there's more to it than that. He's now realising that he's going to have to kill Macduff. He's now decided that he wants to kill Macduff's family. I suppose that bit's more on him. But he's realising that there's no end to this. Just like he said before, blood will have blood. Yeah, and there's not going to be an easy way out. So he decides at this moment that he is still going to send murderers to kill Macduff's family, even though he knows that Macduff isn't actually in the country. Macduff's gone to England. And again, this is the bit that I sometimes, and you probably picked up by now, I love Shakespeare. I think he's brilliant. But there are moments that I just don't quite follow or track the character, because Macbeth didn't start off like this. And I understand the tragic hero thing, but this is something that you should bear in mind for your English essays and your exams. Don't be afraid to kind of debate things and be like, you know, at this point the audience may feel a little bit conflicted about Macbeth, and they may feel a little bit like this doesn't match with the character they met earlier. As long as you are relating it to what you've read, what you know, specific events that happen, you are well within your rights to question and sort of, you know, wonder and go into detail when you think about if things don't add up or if things don't seem, you know, I don't know, logical to you. As long as you are always relating it to how an audience would feel, how an audience could feel, and how it could be argued, and not just like, oh, I don't like it because. So Macbeth, at the end of Act 4, Scene 1, has decided that Macduff's family will have to die. Why, I'm not entirely sure, but again, adds to his cruelty, his tyranny. He's also decided that he's not going to worry too much now. He says, like, this is it now. I'm not going to constantly be thinking about, you know, what's going to happen next, or if I should or shouldn't do things. If he thinks it, he's going to do it from now on. All right. So this is his moment where he sort of, I suppose, really sinks into his future downfall, because he has now decided, nah, this is me, and whatever happens from here on out, I'm committed. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do what needs to be done. So that's what essentially we get when we move into Act 4, Scene 2, because he acts upon his promises, and what he decides is that Macduff's family have to die. So when we get to Act 4, Scene 2, we meet the only other woman in the play, really, and she, I suppose you could argue, is Lady Macbeth's foil character, the opposite, the contrast, because whereas Lady Macbeth is very active in this play, she acts, you know, she does things, she makes movement, she makes things happen, she affects the plot, as it were. Lady Macduff is very much acted upon, okay? So she is passive. She has no control. In some ways, she sort of more typically exemplifies what a woman of the time really would be going through and feel if her husband had sort of gone to England the way that Macduff does. And yes, Macduff does it for noble reasons. But once you see Act 4, Scene 2, you realise that she doesn't see it that way. All right, she's pissed off because how she sees it is he's just abandoned us. Things aren't good in Scotland, remember, okay? Foul whisperings are abroad. People are getting killed for, you know, not being believers or loyal to Macbeth. And she's like, essentially, she calls her husband dead. She's like, well, he's dead to us. And his son, bless him, is like, Mum, no, he's not. Like, leave him alone. She's like, no, he is. He's betrayed us by leaving when he left. Like, this isn't how it should be. He should be here with us. And as I say, the son actually does sort of quite defend him and try to stand up for him. But she is really annoyed. She's not happy at all. And she really feels betrayed by her husband. Now, a messenger turns up and basically says to her, you need to flee because murderers are on their way to get you. And one of the saddest lines in the play, not the saddest, I'll get to the saddest in Act 5, but one of the saddest lines in the play, in my opinion, is when they're like, okay, you got to go. You got to get out of here because you're going to die. And she sort of says, essentially, like, whether should I go? Like, where would I go? Because, again, thinking about the time and thinking about her position as a woman in society in, you know, the 11th century, where's she going to go? And how's she going to survive? You know, she's literally trapped, because ultimately, if she doesn't stay where she is, yeah, okay, she stays, she'll die. But if she goes, she'll die because she wouldn't have any way of supporting herself. Her husband's not there. Ultimately, she's utterly powerless. Yeah, she's got no way of defending herself against Macbeth's evil kind of tyranny and cruelty. So, yeah, like he's gonna, the murderers are on their way, and she can't stop that. And she accepts that pretty much, but she does kind of, you get the impression that she very much blames Macduff, her husband, for leaving. Then we have the moment when the murderers actually kind of come in to the scene, and they sort of ask where Macduff is, and she sort of says, well, he's not here, thank God. He's, you know, you can't get him. So there's a moment of loyalty that she shows, even though she maybe feels let down by him at the same time. And little Macduff, like the son, he sort of tries to say something, and then there's that classic line that students find quite funny when he says sort of quiet, you egg. And it is a ridiculous insult, I suppose, if you think about it. But what is meant by that, and what was meant at the time, was like, okay, you're just an egg, in the sense that you're just new, you're young, you're undeveloped. So, you know, you don't know what you're talking about because you're still a baby. You know, you haven't grown yet. You haven't emerged yet into the real world. So even though it sounds like just a nasty insult, okay, that's not the best thing I've ever done, but never mind. Even though it's kind of, it makes people laugh, there is sort of some metaphor behind it. Anyway, the scene ends with, very sadly, Lady Macduff and her son sort of being chased off, and they are murdered. So we have the end of Lady Macduff. She has a very small role in the play. But I think if you were to maybe think, if you were asked a question potentially about women or gender or, you know, anything like that, I think she'd be a good person to bring in, just in comparison to someone like Lady Macbeth, or just in relation to sort of potentially something a little bit different to talk about if you were talking about context and gender roles and gender expectations, because you've got a chance there to not just go like, oh, Lady Macbeth, you know, she didn't fit gender roles because she was this, she was that. Lady Macduff is a little bit more vulnerable as a result of her place in society being a woman. So whereas Lady Macbeth rejects that, Lady Macduff doesn't seem to be given a choice. She just sort of has to live that way. So that's pretty much the end of Act 4, Scene 2. Now we get to one of my favourite acts in the play, and that's Act 4, Scene 3. And this is where we go over to England. All right, so we leave Scotland and we go and see what Macduff and Malcolm have been up to. And what we discover is that they have been in England attempting to get King Edward the Confessor, that's who was the king in England at the time. They've been attempting to get him to sort of give them some, like an army to go back to Scotland with, to overthrow Macbeth. And we find out that they have been granted that, okay, and they were granted an army, and I think it says that they're given 10,000 men to go back to Scotland with. So that's great, and this is something that we're going to get onto, because if you ever get a question on anything like kingship, and I stand by, this is going to come up soon, this is a brilliant scene for kingship, because you get so many references to the idea of, you know, what makes a good king, what makes a bad king. Remember I said very early on, one of the big themes of this play is the idea of kingship, you know, because King James was fascinated by the responsibilities a king had. He wrote sort of multiple books and letters and pieces of writing about it. So it's really important to remember this scene in some detail if you ever were to be asked a question about kingship. And if you're not sure about this scene, I'm here to help you. So we're in England, okay? And the first thing we see is that Malcolm and Macduff are really sad, okay? And that sounds a little bit simple, but we really do need to bear that in mind. They're properly sad because the key here is to realise that they are genuinely good people that genuinely love Scotland, and they are devastated that Scotland is in this sort of state of, they say it's sinking beneath the yoke. They call it this, Shakespeare uses this personification of Scotland where it's like this wounded woman. Every day a new gash appears. Every day Macbeth being on the throne is causing more and more pain and destruction to the country. Again, we talked a little bit about the chain of being in a previous video, but it's all that, isn't it? It's the fact that God himself is punishing the land and chaos reigns because there shouldn't be this king in power. This king shouldn't be there because he has usurped the king and he has completely disrupted that chain of being. So again, bear these things in mind when we think about Scotland and the state it would actually be in, because I don't feel like it's not an obvious thing in the sense that there aren't loads of stage directions describing how bad Scotland would have been or sort of how awful it should all be. But the way they talk about Scotland and what it's sort of been like since that tyrant took over, it makes it quite obvious that Scotland's in a bad way, okay? It's this diseased woman almost that just is sort of suffering all the time. And Malcolm is devastated, and he says, like, let's sit sort of here under this tree and like weep our bosoms empty. So Macduff and Malcolm are joined in their sadness about what's happening to Scotland. And they also are joined in their absolute kind of their loathing of Macbeth. I mentioned earlier, at this point in the play, they've started calling him a tyrant. They've started not giving him a name because it's like they say, his sole name blisters our tongues. Yeah, it makes them. They feel like even the thought of saying his name is going to do them bodily harm. You know, it's hellish to speak of him, so they'd burn their tongues to say his name. And they talk about, you know, that Scotland's terrible and they don't know what to do about it. But what's really clever at this point is, I mentioned earlier as well, that Malcolm is almost like his dad, but a new and improved version of his dad, because Malcolm says to him, look, like, I know you're here and that's great, but you were mates with Macbeth, and, you know, I've got a lot of reason to be a little bit suspicious of you. And he says he hasn't touched you yet, and it wouldn't be on the realms of sort of, it wouldn't be on the realms of possibility that Macbeth has got you on his side and has sent you to me, and I'm weak, I'm young, and I'm, you know, ultimately like a sacrificial lamb, and you could be bringing me back to keep him happy. And this reminds us as well, like I said last time, of quite how terrifying living in this Scotland, this version of Scotland would be, because people wouldn't have known who to trust, and Malcolm certainly wouldn't have known who to trust, because obviously his dad was just murdered by someone he thought he trusted. So bear that in mind as well when we move on to what Malcolm now does, because Macduff sort of goes, no, you can trust me, I'm not treacherous. And Malcolm quite fairly sort of goes, well, yeah, that's what a liar would say. You know, that's what someone would say to me if they were a murderer and they were treacherous. And Macduff sort of goes, okay, well, there's not much I can do to sort of, you know, convince you. And he kind of almost gives up, and he's like, well, look, I can see you don't really know me then, if that's what you think. And Malcolm sort of goes, no, sorry, mate, it's fine. Like, I'm just nervous. Fair enough, Malcolm, we'll let you off. You are just nervous. You've had a pretty bad time of it. So at this point, Malcolm starts doing his sort of deception, all right? And this is why I always think as well that deception will be a theme that comes up at some point in this play, because you could always debate the obvious deception of people like Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, but also you could talk about deception when it's for a good cause, because what Malcolm now does is essentially deceives Macduff to test his loyalty, to make sure that he can rely on him. And so what he does is he goes, right, well, you know, when all's said and done and when everything finishes, actually, I think Scotland's going to be in a worse position. And Macduff's like, it can't be worse. What do you mean? And he goes, no. Like, I know Macbeth's bad, but he's going to look as white as snow compared to, like, what's going to happen when I'm in power. And Macduff's like, that's not possible. Macbeth's the worst. And Malcolm sort of goes, yeah, I know. He says, I grant him bloody and avaricious and all these things. But then he sort of starts saying the things that he would do. Sorry, I do apologise. I've got to lean down for a sec. He starts talking about the things that he would do if he were to be king. And he, first of all, again, in a nutshell, says, he basically says, well, I would want every woman in the country. They're all mine, and I would rape all of them even if they didn't want me. Yeah, everybody, they're all mine. Mine. And he's trying to see how loyal Macduff is to the rightful king and to the country and to check his intentions, right? And so Macduff kind of goes, oh, all right, well, and he tries to sort of justify it. And he kind of goes, okay, well, fair enough. You're the king and technically they all belong to you. And also he was like, I don't think you'll have any trouble finding willing women. I don't think you have to take them by force, because there's going to be women all over the place that want to, sleep with a king. And, that's fine. And he kind of justifies it, I suppose, to himself almost, like, okay, that's still all right. We're still all right to be wanting Malcolm to be king. And so Malcolm, and obviously what you've got to understand is I'm telling you this in the hindsight of we know it now, but as the audience are first watching it, they're just thinking for a minute, what is Malcolm doing? Like, what is he saying? Why is he saying he's going to do this stuff? Is he really as bad as this? So the next thing he says is, okay, well, that didn't work then. So he goes, well, also, I'm just going to take everybody's stuff. He's like, I want everybody's land. I want everybody's property. I want everybody's houses. It's all mine. Mine. So if I become king, I'm going to take everything. And again, Macduff's a little bit like, okay, well, again, not ideal, but it's all yours because you are going to be the king. And that is, I guess, fair enough. And so Malcolm then brings out the big guns. Now, I don't know how much context you've done on this, but there was a sort of belief at the time that the king, the rightful king, would have a number of what they call graces or virtues. And they're listed in this play, in this scene now. I wish I could remember them all. I do apologise. But it's things like humility and temperance, sort of being good, being humble, being kind, being understanding, being compassionate. And he sort of says, well, Malcolm goes, yeah, but what about these graces? No, Macduff says, well, as long as you've got those graces, you're fine. And Malcolm's like, the graces, like this. Nah, I've got none of them. And he insists that he doesn't have any of these graces, right? And this is the last straw for Macduff. But he doesn't sort of get angry or, try and kill Malcolm or anything. He just sort of pretty much falls to his knees and weeps. And he's like, well, Scotland, poor Scotland, and his only care is for the fate of Scotland, because he doesn't question that Malcolm shouldn't be on the throne exactly. He doesn't think he's fit to govern, but he also knows that he's the rightful king, because that's what the chain of being, and that's what his obviously he was the rightful king through his lineage. And he talks about the fact that, your mother was so pious, she was praying all the time. Your father was wonderful. How did this happen? Why is this what you are? And he kind of basically gives up on everything, and he's devastated because he's like, well, I don't know how to fix this then, because you are the person meant to be king and you are worse than Macbeth. You make Macbeth look all right. And he's just absolutely devastated. But at that point, Malcolm sort of goes, oh, it's all right. Sorry, like, I just wanted to check that you were, trustworthy. And Macduff's a little bit disgruntled by this. And Macduff's a bit like, all right, thanks for that. Really appreciate that test that you gave me. But, I think we can sort of all potentially understand that. And Malcolm actually says, look, that's the first time, doing that just then is the first time I've ever deceived anybody. I don't lie, I'm still a virgin, so I wouldn't rape everyone, blah, blah, blah. And he sort of goes through all of the reasons actually he should be king. Now, this is one of the ways that Shakespeare talks about kingship, the idea that actually a real king cares about his country. Macbeth at no point talks about Scotland. He doesn't at any point mention that Scotland's in a mess. He's just like, well, people are whispering about me. No one trusts me. People are trying to kill me. People are trying to overthrow me. I'll kill them. Whereas all Malcolm talks about is Scotland being a mess. Scotland being diseased. Scotland and his people suffering. Now, that could potentially tie back in with the fact that King James saw the king and role being a king and having that role as almost being like a father to your subjects. And it's not just one way, it's a mutual contract. You both have to give your side of, caring about each other and doing your part. So the king doesn't get away with it just because he's king. Anyway, so this scene, Malcolm sort of apologises for leading Macduff down that path, but he does also, we then sort of learn a little bit about the King of England. And again, Macbeth does this, Shakespeare does this, I think, to be highlighting all the good things about the other kings, that again, it really, really emphasises how bad Macbeth is, because we at this point discover that Edward, the Confessor, is a very pious king, okay? And it's said that he has healing hands. Now, a little fact, context-wise, is actually in the time that King Edward the Confessor, a real king, was in power, so sort of the, like the 1000s, he had what they used to call sort of healing ceremonies, and it was believed that he could heal you by touching you. And so thousands of people would queue outside his palace to be healed and touched by him. And this was a real thing that happened. He did it to thousands of people. So you're looking at a king that's sort of seen to be, and obviously that would only happen if they were blessed and anointed as the rightful king. So therefore God would shine down and agree clearly with that appointment, as opposed to someone like Macbeth, who has only taken the crown by violent and murderous means, and he is not, he's obviously not supported by God, and he's not supposed to be there. So again, this idea of Edward being this pious king, he's given them this army to take back, he's healing his people, he's wonderful. This all ties back in with this idea of what makes a good king and what makes a bad king, okay? And we learn that he has been doing these healings, and he's been doing all these good things. I hear little feet coming in. Right, so just to summarise then, by the time we get to the end of Act 4, a lot in these three scenes has happened, because we now are very aware of what Macbeth's plan is and how Macbeth is planning to behave. He has got no intention of looking back. He doesn't now regret anything he's done. That Macbeth we saw early on in the play, who was feeling worried and guilty and not sure, he's now essentially promised himself no more. Okay, no more. I'm going to make sure that no matter what happens, I act on my impulses. I have now, obviously, he's now had Lady Macduff killed, Lady Macduff's children killed, and the last part of Act 4 is when a messenger turns up from Scotland to England, right? And Macduff actually says, okay, so how are my kids? How's my wife? And there's this weird moment of dramatic irony where for some reason the messenger doesn't immediately tell him. So the messenger at first sort of says, oh yeah, like everything's fine. Yeah, not a problem. Don't worry about it. And a little bit into the conversation where we're discovering how bad everything is and Macbeth is just destroying everything. At that point, the messenger then sort of goes, oh, by the way, I told you everything was fine. Actually, then it's not fine because everyone's dead and everyone's been horribly murdered in your family. And obviously, Macduff is sort of like, oh, good grief, what do you mean? And he says, like, all of them? And he keeps asking the same question, like, all of them. It reminds me of how Banquo reacts when he finds out Duncan's dead. It's that complete innocent bewilderment, because they love, they talk about people they love being dead, and he's devastated by that. And he says, all my pretty chickens, all in one fell swoop. Now, he's obviously devastated. What I love about this is that Malcolm, at this point, shows himself to be actually a very progressive version of a man, because he doesn't just go, right, we've got to now go and kill Macbeth even more. He actually says, like, give sorrow words, okay? The grief that does not speak is the grief that will break your heart. And actually, if you think about it, he's like, come on, mate, talk about this. Let's talk this through. It's a very unconventional way for a man at the time to think and to say. And he's telling Macduff, yes, you need to, make this the whetstone of your grief, sharpen your anger with this, use this to fuel your revenge. But he's also saying, give yourself a chance to think about it. Give yourself a chance to feel sad. And I always think that shows again that Malcolm is like a sort of new and improved version of his dad. He's like forward thinking into the future Malcolm, who's bringing everything a little bit more into, I don't know, again, Shakespeare being very progressive, I think. So he tells Macduff, look, we are going to get your revenge. Ultimately, Macbeth being told to beware Macduff and then killing Macduff's family, ironically, kind of sealed his fate even more to be killed by Macduff. Spoilers, sorry, but I'm assuming you knew that. So, yeah, there's a real sort of moment at the end of this where Macduff's been completely destroyed, but then uses this, and Malcolm makes sure that he sort of, gives him that advice. Use this. Don't let it blunt your anger. Let it enrage you. Let it make you extra angry, and then make sure that we get Macbeth because of it. So by the end of Act 4, Macbeth's days are pretty much numbered because he's getting mad on power. He's resolved to do anything he needs to hold on to that power, but Macduff's on his way back, all right? So things are looking like they're coming to a climax, which they are. We'll move on to Act 5 in the next video. And sorry if the sound's bad or the quality's bad, apologies. I don't know how this is going to sound until I listen to it. Still doing one take. But yeah, hopefully that's helped with Act 4, and I'll see you next time.